A note before we start. This episode mentions suicide. From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Thursday, October 16, 2025. Former Alice Springs school principal Gavin Morris has been found guilty of 4 counts of aggravated assault. Magistrate Anthony Hopkins found the former Yipirinya principal choked 2 Indigenous pupils and forcefully pulled the ears of 2 others, in a judgment handed down on Wednesday. The matter will return to court on December 8. Former Western Australian Premier Mark McGowan has urged federal and state governments to cut spending and reduce reliance on taxes. A $20 billion budget black hole is looming after Treasurer Jim Chalmers dumped his big superannuation tax reform. Those stories are live right now at theaustralian.com.au. Victorian parents have accused Premier Jacinta Allan of being alarmist and sensational about transgender children. What they actually want is to be involved in potentially life-altering decisions about their kids' well-being. But the state's education department is leaning on a loophole that means they're being kept in the dark. That's today's episode.
So I would hope, Rachel, well, you're going to dispute the higher rates of suicide amongst transgender kids.
This is Victorian Premier Jacinta Allan speaking at a press conference on Wednesday.
Rachel, I will answer your questions if you give me the opportunity to complete the question that you have asked before you interject with another one.
Rachel, who the Premier is referring to, is The Australian's senior reporter Rachel Baxendale.
So if we can have this responsible discussion, that would be the most appropriate way, and then we can finish up this press conference.
The Premier was riled up over reporting by The Australian, which revealed Allan's government doesn't know how many children enrolled in public schools have socially transitioned their gender without their parents knowing or consenting to it. Here's Rachel.
So it's not the same as just being gender non-conforming. It's actually being known by a different name. If someone is biologically female, it's them actually being referred to as if they are a boy. They become he, him, and vice versa. The psychologists and the experts I've been talking to are very careful to make that distinction. They're not seeking to make people feel uncomfortable for being who they are.
In Victoria, the Education Department advises teachers and school staff to treat kids who exhibit signs of gender dysphoria as mature minors.
So this is a legal definition that's been used in other medical contexts, where essentially in a situation where parents are deemed to not be capable or supporting their children in making a decision, another authority will decide that the child is mature enough and sufficiently understands the gravity of the decision they're making to make that decision for themselves. Unconventionally, this is being used in Victorian schools to enable students to make the decision to socially transition without their parents' consent or knowledge. The problem that a lot of critics have with it is that there is no framework in place to establish what actually constitutes unsupportive parents. And there's a huge spectrum between parents having completely reasonable, legitimate concerns about the potential for this to lead down a pathway to irreversible consequences, and more sinister concerns that a lot of trans activists and the government like to insinuate, such as simply being transphobic. And I'm yet to talk to a parent who I regard as transphobic. The parents I'm talking to are perfectly comfortable with the fact that their child might be gender non-conforming. They're perfectly comfortable with the fact that some of their children are same-sex attracted. That's not a problem. What they are concerned about is whether or not this is sending their kids down a path towards irreversible, lifelong negative consequences.
What is required of teachers and school staff in this situation? What are they advised to do?
There's not a whole lot of documentation around this and there aren't very firm guidelines. What I did find in my reporting was some communication between Safe Schools, which is a division within the State Education Department that advocates for the rights of LGBTIQA plus students, and teachers who were asking, I've got a gender dysphoric child in my class, what should I do? And the information that we found in that Freedom of Information request was that Safe Schools is advising teachers that in a situation where a child wants to socially transition their gender, then the teacher is advised that they should do that either with the parents' or carers' permission or with the child as a mature minor. They're advised not to talk to the parents or carers without seeking permission from the child first. And then they're further advised that if there's no parent or carer permission or mature minor classification, no changes can be made. And what I'm hearing from the parent group I've been talking to that represents more than 50 parents in Victoria of children with gender distress is that they have accused schools in Victoria of using this mature minor designation indiscriminately, was the word they used. And their concern is that essentially teachers are making these decisions without the knowledge that parents have of the full picture of who the child is and of their health considerations. And many of the students who are wanting to make this decision have very complex health situations. A lot of them are neurodiverse, so autism spectrum disorder, and a lot of them have a history of trauma and other mental health issues. And they're also concerned that they, as the parents, and as in very many cases the most important support network for their child, are essentially being isolated at the most difficult point in their children's lives and prevented from playing a part in helping their children make life-changing decisions.
Victoria's Education Minister Ben Carroll told the state's parliament the department doesn't collect data on how many school children have been designated mature minors because the decisions are made by individual schools. That was in response to a question on Notice by Liberal MP Moira Deeming, who's a women's rights advocate and former school teacher. She says the lack of a paper trail means it can become impossible to unpick the decisions later.
So Ben Carroll did state in response to that question from Moira Deeming that the school staff should take into consideration both the rights of the students and the rights of the parents as set out in the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Act. But it's very difficult to understand that there's absolutely no detail provided. There are no guidelines explaining how the teacher or other school staff member should go about doing that. And it's very difficult to understand how that could be done, how a parent's rights could be taken into account if they're not even told about this decision.
According to the experts, there's no evidence that socially transitioning improves the mental health of gender dysphoric kids, and it can set them on a path that can be difficult to reverse if it's not the right one.
They are warning that social transition, this very serious psychosocial step, is very often, and there are a lot of statistics internationally that back this up, leads down a path towards a medicalised treatment. So we're talking about puberty blockers, hormones and surgery. So often the defence and certainly the government in the past has said, we don't need to be worried about this, it's just social, it's not medical. The response that a lot of the experts I've been talking to have to that is that it very often leads to that medical transition and to treatments that have very clear side effects and consequences, such as loss of sexual and reproductive function, cancer risk, osteoporosis. There are all kinds of consequences from hormones and then again from surgery that are very serious and irreversible.
Coming up, why Jacinta Allen is on the defensive about trans kids.
Rachel, I'm not going to engage with you in a debate about what is the different levels of the rate of suicide amongst transgender kids. I am just not. That is just so deeply irresponsible, and because the data that I have says that transgender kids are.
Why do you think Jacinta Allen had such a strong response to your reporting on this issue, Rachel, despite the fact that she said, as I understand it, she hadn't read it?
I think the government have dug themselves into a very deep hole on this issue. Their policy position is one of supporting gender affirmative care no matter what. And that position basically means that they're not prepared to even answer questions or acknowledge the mounting evidence internationally that this may be causing harm to children.
So why then did the Premier start talking about the suicide risk among transgender children in response to your questions?
I think it's a classic example of deflection. She didn't want to engage with the expert opinions. She didn't want to engage with the concerns of parents. She just wanted to use this suicide line, which a number of experts and parents groups this afternoon have pointed out is deeply irresponsible. They've accused her of making alarmist and sensational claims that they see as being quite dangerous in the context of the very vulnerable group that we're talking about. And they've pointed to the fact that it is very unusual and that mental health groups advise strongly against talking about suicide in a way that implies that it is common among a particular group, because of the risk that may, in fact, have the effect of promoting suicidal ideation.
And what does the evidence say about the rate of suicide among trans children?
So the reference that the Premier made to suicide was a repetition of a line that her government uses every time this issue gets written about, which is to cite a statistic that comes from the advocacy group LGBTIQ plus Health Australia, which hasn't cited a source for the statistic, but that states that transgender young people are 15 times more likely to attempt suicide than the general population. It appears that the Premier actually misspoke because she repeated that statistic but spoke about it as committing suicide, which is very different, obviously, to attempting suicide. And the other data we have on this issue, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare website states that there are no reliable national data on rates of suicide and self-harm among LGBTI plus communities in Australia. So they're essentially saying that they don't believe that there is sufficiently rigorous data on this for them to put forward a statistic one way or the other.
Rachel Baxendale is a senior reporter with The Australian. You can read her reporting on this issue right now at theaustralian.com.au.